Okay, thank you very much for having me. This is joint work with Ray Fissman and Shahar Karif. And it's a little bit of something completely different in the sense that this isn't actually explicitly about charity, but about the types of preferences that motivate that sort of giving. So redistribution is a core function of government. It's involved in almost every task that government undertakes. We can think about healthcare reform, we can think about tax policy, the provision of education. And we know that economists typically think about political support for redistribution in terms of the median voter theorem. So people basically vote out of their own self-interest. And in the context of the United States, this has led to something of a puzzle because, as we all are well aware, inequality has gone up in recent decades, but political support for redistribution has not gone up as we would expect. And so this has recently led to some interest in the public finance literature about why this might be, and an awareness that people vote both in favor of policies that are in their own self-interest, and they also potentially vote because they have non-selfish distributional preferences, and they may differ in terms of their perceptions of what constitutes a fair level of redistribution, a fair level of inequality, etc. And so in order to understand public opinion in terms of support for these types of redistributive policies, we need to understand the distributional preferences of the general population. So distributional preferences, we can think of decomposing them into two separate components. So there's a weight that you place on yourself vis-a-vis everyone else, and then independent of that weight, there's the way that you're willing to make trade-offs between equality and efficiency, what I'm going to term equality and efficiency. So minimizing inequality is one goal and maximizing the average payoff is another. And often those things work against each other. And these two motives, self-interest versus fair-mindedness and equality-efficiency trade-offs, they operate together in many decision problems, but they're conceptually distinct. And so in particular, fair-minded people who put equal weight on themselves and others may disagree about the extent to which average income should be reduced in order to minimize inequality. So for instance, in the United States, we typically associate supporters of the Democratic Party with greater support for government redistribution, and yet it's an important question and not one. It's an empirical question and not one that we know the answer to, whether those voters, those Democratic voters, actually are more willing to pay to reduce average incomes in order to minimize inequality. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a dictator game that allows us to decompose individual social preferences into these two distinct components, fair-mindedness and equality-efficiency trade-offs. And we're going to embed this dictator game in a very large, diverse sample of adult Americans. So this is going to give us a snapshot of the distributional preferences of the general population of the United States. So we're going to look at that, and then we're going to turn to looking at the question of whether these distributional preferences measured in dictator games have something to say about political support for redistribution. So as many of you are aware, a number of famous economists, including some who may have been involved in organizing this conference, have questioned whether social preferences measured in dictator games actually tell us something about the real world, the non-lab world. And so we're going to look at that by linking the decisions that people make in these dictator games with their voting behavior, which is also covered in other modules of the longitudinal survey that we're working with. So in the interest of time, I'm going to hope to get to my results, so I'm just going to plow right ahead. So our experimental design, it's a variant of the Andreoni and Miller modified dictator game, where it's exactly the design in a paper in the AER from 2007, Fissman, Karif, and Markovitz. It involves a decision problem where a subject chooses an allocation to pi s, pi o, where pi s is the payoff to self and pi o is the payoff to the recipient in the dictator game, subject to a budget constraint. So the idea is we're varying the price of giving. The price of giving is not always one. And we're going to use a graphical interface that presents this type of modified dictator game in a very user-friendly point-and-click environment, which I will show you. So the y-axis indicates the amount of money to yourself in terms of experimental currency tokens. The x-axis indicates the amount of money that you give to the recipient. And we're going to vary this budget line over the course of 50 independent decision problems. So the budget lines are chosen at random. They're chosen so that at least one intercept exceeds 50 tokens, and they're sort of independently chosen, and at the end of the experiment, one of these dictator games will be implemented to determine final payouts. So what's nice about this design is that by confronting subjects with 50 independent decision problems, we see how their allocations change as we vary the price of giving. So specifically, we can think of a spectrum of equality efficiency trade-offs, where on one end we have the extreme case of Rawlsian or maximum utility over monetary payoffs, and at the other end we have, Rawlsian, or, yeah, I said that. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have utilitarians who have, in essence, linear indifference curves and are entirely focused on maximizing average payoffs and not addressing inequality. We can think of Cobb-Douglas utility as intermediate between the two. And more generally, if we see that basically as you increase the price of redistribution, the price of allocating tokens from yourself to the recipient, if as you increase that price, the amount that you spend on the recipient goes up, then you're between Cobb-Douglas and Rawlsian. So you're focused on minimizing inequality. And if as you increase the price of giving, the amount of your budget that you spend on the other person goes down, then you're focused on maximizing average payoff. So we can use this experiment to put people on this sort of spectrum. Now, more specifically, with very minimal assumptions on preferences, so basically if we assume that preferences over own consumption and others' payoffs are also homothetic and additively separable, then we know that the utility function that subjects are maximizing has to be represented by a constant elasticity of substitution form. And so we're going to estimate these constant elasticity of substitution utility functions at the individual level for all of the subjects in our experiment. These utility functions have two parameters. So alpha is going to index fair-mindedness, the weight that you place on yourself relative to the other subject. So you can see if you place a weight of 1/2 on yourself, you're completely fair-minded, and if you put all of the weight on yourself, your alpha is going to be equal to 1. Rho indicates the curvature of the altruistic indifference curves, where as rho approaches negative infinity, your indifference curves come to look like right angles. So you're very focused on minimizing inequality, and as rho approaches 1, your indifference curves come to look like straight lines, and so you're entirely focused on maximizing average payoffs. And again, rho gives us this spectrum from Rawlsian to utilitarianism. And so we're going to, because we have 50 decisions, we can just estimate this through maximum likelihood, controlling for censoring of the budget share that you allocate to the recipient at 0 and 1, and we do this at the individual subject level. Okay, so the context in which we do this is we embed this problem, this experiment in the American Life panel, which is a broad and heterogeneous sample of adult American voters. There are about 6,000 American adults in the panel, and we randomly sample from those for whom complete demographic information is available. We have a population of 1,002 subjects who complete the experiment, and we match each subject with another respondent from the American Life panel who is not participating in the experiment. So what's important about this is that this design differs a bit from a standard dictator game you might think of in a university lab. It's a bit more relevant to the context of thinking about tax policy, because your recipient is in essence a randomly drawn American, and so is not necessarily going to look like you. They're going to look like another American citizen from anywhere in the country, from any economic class, etc. So the characteristics of our subjects, and sorry if this is a bit small, the characteristics of our subjects are indicated here. We can compare our subjects to those who log in and don't complete the experiment, to those who were invited but may not have seen the email, to the entire American Life panel, and this is from the American Community Survey. This is the adult population of the United States. And you can see that on most measures, our subjects are very similar to the overall population of the United States. Okay, so I probably don't have time to talk about this, but we test whether preferences are rational, which would just sort of justify estimating these individual level utility functions, and there is some noise as you would expect, but basically they are. So the distribution of parameters, so this is just for comparison. This is a sample of university subjects from the UC Berkeley XLab population. you can see that relative to university subjects, the general population is much more fair-minded. So on average, that's not surprising to anyone who pays attention to experimental economics, I think. But so on average, subjects allocate themselves about 2/3 of the budget and allocate the rest to the recipient. So that's higher than the 28% that has been thrown around from Engel's meta-analysis today. You can also see that the general population of the United States, these are the estimated row parameters, and of course, again, a more negative number means you're more focused on minimizing inequality as opposed to maximizing average payouts. The general population of the United States is also much more focused on minimizing inequality than the student population. And again, this is consistent with previous studies suggesting that young people tend to be relatively focused on efficiency. So we can just sort of categorize people in terms of whether their alpha parameters are close to 1/2, close to 1, or in between, and whether their rows are significantly less than 1, significantly greater than 1, or in between. And you can see this general breakdown. We have about equal numbers of subjects who are significantly equality focused and significantly efficiency focused. So you can see that there's a sort of full spectrum in the US population with people having very strong but very heterogeneous views. So what we've done in this figure, just to sort of show you this breakdown, is this is for the entire sample. This is for the fair-mindedness parameter alpha. Each sort of subpanel here partitions the set of subjects into mutually exclusive categories. So you can see there are a couple of things I'd like you to notice about this. So the first is that there are some things that are associated with greater fair-mindedness or selfishness. So generally, more educated subjects tend to be more selfish. Minority groups tend to be less selfish in our data, and selfishness is essentially correlated with income. But you can also see, so these orange circles are the 25th and 75th percentiles. What's important about this is that within each of these categories, we observe an enormous amount of heterogeneity. And in fact, when we put this into a regression framework, we find that there are some significant relationships. I'll show you in just another slide, but that all of these demographic characteristics explain only about 5% of the variation in fair-mindedness, and state fixed effects explain another 5%. So most of this heterogeneity is essentially unobservable heterogeneity in preferences, which is why it's so important to look at the individual level. We can look at the same thing for row. I've got the means, but it's a very skewed distribution, so I'm more interested in showing you the medians. Again, you see there are some things, education, ethnicity, that are correlated with differences in equality, efficiency, orientation, but there's a huge amount of heterogeneity within each of these categories. So when we put, of course, some of those categories are correlated. When we put this into a sort of kitchen sink style regression, we find that African Americans and the least educated groups tend to be significantly more fair-minded in our setup than other Americans. And younger subjects, lower income subjects, and African Americans are more efficiency focused, and women, this is consistent with previous studies, are more equality focused. Now, it's important to sort of focus on this when we think about moving to political results, because if you remember any recent elections, and you think about, I have 1 minute, I'm going to talk very quickly, you think about groups that tended to vote for the Democratic presidential candidate, they're exactly, somewhat surprisingly, those groups that are more focused on efficiency in our data. So when we look at political decisions, we're going to first control for all of this demographic stuff and essentially look within cells at your equality efficiency trade-offs. And so because I have 1 minute, I'm going to do this very quickly. And the point to take away is that, so I do this because of the skewed distribution. I have row itself, I have a decile indicator, and then just an indicator for being efficiency focused. You can see that it is, when we use both, whether you voted for Barack Obama or whether you consider yourself a Democrat, we find that the being efficiency focused is negatively and significantly related to how likely you are to be a Democrat and how likely you are to have voted for Barack Obama. To give you a sense of the magnitudes, this are you efficiency focused is larger than any other characteristic except being from a minority group in terms of the amount of variation in political orientation it explains. And when we include this, it explains about 15 to 20% of the gender gap in voting behavior. So it's a very large effect in magnitude, and now I have to stop. Thank you very much.